Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. I'm here starting to work on preparing the whole area for more tomatoes. And this video, as you've seen from the title, is about not making this one particular tomato growing mistake. It's nothing to do with, say, pruning out the suckers or planting distances, etc. It's actually about something that I feel is most often forgotten. It's about the actual soil in which the tomatoes grow in. Because I think, being in the UK and the climate that we have, it's very easy to forget that in their native habitat, tomatoes are a short-lived perennial plant. And if we use that knowledge, we can actually change the way we approach or the kind of strategy that we use to improve soil health, to get better tomato yields, and more importantly, the healthiest soil and the healthiest plants possible, because that's going to translate to good taste. And if you're a bit like me, sometimes you can kind of forget about the polytunnels over winter. And now is the right time to start making sure that your beds never dry out. So we're going to reinstall this soaker hose and start making sure that there's moisture getting in to this soil. I'm going to clear this whole bed and get it nice and prepped and ready. But the reason why I mentioned that tomatoes in their native environment are short-lived perennials is that perennials by their nature need a slightly different type of soil in comparison to annuals. Annuals prefer more bacterially dominated soils. Perennials, they prefer to have more fungal dominated soils. Short-lived perennials stand somewhere in the middle. They appreciate some bacteria and they appreciate some fungi as well. And so what you're trying to create is a soil that can enable both fungi and bacteria to thrive. Because if you think about fungi, so say take a tree for example, some fungi form symbiotic relationships with the roots of plants. They're called mycorrhizal fungi. And when this happens to a tree, if it makes this association, it can extend the root area, the absorption area of the tree's roots by up to 700 times. And this opens up the potential for the tree to get a lot more nutrients it needs, and also mycorrhizal fungi help increase the water uptake of that plant as well, thus making it more resilient during drier weather. Now, why do these bacteria and fungi even matter? Well, what they do is they help feed the plants in a sense. The soil life works with the plants to help provide the nutrients and make the nutrients plant available in the first place. The thing that a lot of garden centres and like plant feed companies don't like to kind of remind you about is that when you have a healthy soil life, it greatly reduces the need for applying feed or any other additional bits of fertility for the plants, because the soil biology is working hard to do that for the plants, so you don't actually need to worry so much about feeding. And so that's a really useful way over the long run to cut costs, because fortunately all of the ways to improve soil health, and especially for tomatoes to both encourage fungi and also the bacteria, you got a ton of low cost or free methods to use at your disposal. So tomatoes can create these symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizal fungi. There's been quite a few studies, especially in commercial tomato production, where they've inoculated, for example, seedlings with some kind of beneficial soil fungus, and they've seen increases in Brix levels, which means sweeter, kind of more tasty. And I'll post some of those studies down below in the video description. I also came across one where, sadly, some of these like modern hybridized varieties, the ability to work with soil microbes has been bred out of them, which is why feeding them is basically the only way to grow them and guarantee good yields. And so in this specific context of the video, I'm chatting more about growing heritage tomato varieties, ones that are a little bit closer to their kind of native counterparts. There was a study that looked into how mycorrhizal fungi could improve root growth, and there were some modern varieties where their root growth increased by 50% when they were inoculated with fungi, but there were others which didn't change whatsoever. There is one issue that I have with a lot of these studies, is that sadly they're only really testing and they're using one or a little handful of species, of fungi species, when in reality there's about 50,000 known species of fungi that form mycorrhizal associations. And if you watch this channel, you know I am all for diversity when it comes to bringing complete plant health and bringing some great yields. What I really want to focus on is what happens when you just take away focusing on one or two fungal species and instead just focus on making the environment of the soil as inviting as possible to bring as much diversity in both fungi and bacteria, because that is what creates a strong, resilient and productive growing space. And I'm going to run through a list of ideas, things that I'm going to try out, and just suggestions. There's no one size fits all approach, but things that you can do to encourage a really nice healthy soil for your tomato plants. So the first thing is, as I've mentioned before, you want to make sure that you keep and retain moisture in the soil. So usually when you have plants growing, these leaves, they can cast shade and they can really help with keeping moisture in the soil, because when you have a bare soil, the moisture can evaporate. And so using something like mulch, last year in the polycrub, I mulched all the tomato plants with grass clippings, which after having the drought and basically running out of water was probably one of the best things I managed to do last year. And the other thing that happens when you add a mulch is that it helps create a more stable soil temperature. When you're just using compost, it's very dark. So during the hottest part of the day, the compost temperature, the soil temperature can rise really high, and then it can fall quite a lot over the evening, and so you've got quite a big jump between soil temperature. However, with a mulch, you add a bit of stability to the soil temperature, which is going to help those soil microbes. Now, this advice doesn't always apply if you're in a fairly cool climate. Even here in Wales, even in having a polytunnel, we can get long cool periods during the peak of the growing season, and that is when bare soil can actually be an advantage, because it warms up, it acts as a bit of a heat sink. But the only issue is that bare soil is kind of the worst thing you want to do for soil health. And so adding an extra light layer of compost, maybe some leaf molds, is a really way to improve that. Or alternatively, if you create two different amendments. One is LAB, lactobacillus. This is known as kind of creating microbes, which are the emergency service workers of the soil, to help kickstart it, keep it nice and healthy. The other amendment to make and apply as a liquid amendment as well is Jadam microbial solution that's made using leaf mold, and it adds a load of goodness as well to the soil. So if you do have bare soil, as long as you're adding that every 2 to 3 weeks, it's going to really improve it, and the bareness of the soil is actually going to be less of a burden on your tomato plants. In a cool climate like mine, bare soil is really useful for helping to kickstart all of my plants earlier off in spring because of the extra temperature. But by July time, due to the higher ambient temperatures, I will then mulch anything that has bare ground underneath it in a polytunnel, usually with something like grass clippings. The easiest way to add fungal life to a bed is to include woody type of materials, but this causes a bit of a problem. If you use general wood chip, the carbon to nitrogen ratio is so high that where the wood chip touches the surface of the soil, it can uptake some of that nitrogen. But a way of working around that is by using Ramur chip wood, which is wood chip that you create from the smaller branches of a tree, under 7 centimeters in diameter. This is where around 3/4 of all of the minerals and nutrients in a tree are found. So the carbon to nitrogen ratio is far more favorable, but you still got that nice woodiness. And from my experience of using Ramur chip woods, whether it's on pathways or for mulching or even just keeping in a pile to break down, I'd never seen such amazing fungal growth. And so my idea for this year is, when I plant my tomatoes, I'm going to create roughly a 25 centimeter diameter around each plant, where I'm going to mulch with a 2 centimeter layer of Ramur chipped wood. That is to encourage the fungi to the soil to have a nice kind of place to then go exploring and to start breaking down that Ramur chip wood. But then I'll probably, for the most part, to begin with, leave bare patches in between each plant. So you've got that ring of Ramur chipwood, you've then got the dark soil, which I will use as a heat sink and apply JMS and LAB to. And then in July time, I then have the option of I can interplant if I want to. I'll already be planting basil around the outside, but I can underplant things because the stem will be nice and clear. Or I could then mulch with something, like I mentioned before, the grass clippings. I found some absolutely fascinating studies on Ramur chipwood. I think we're still very much at the beginning of the potential that it holds. An example here, we're planting this linear food forest, and so we're going to be mulching around each tree with Ramur chipwood, because that is a great way to bring fungal life to the trees so they can start to create those connections, rather than having to buy like that mycorrhizal root powder, which is just a little bit of an extra expense. So I'm really excited to see how that's going to pan out. Now, not everyone has access to making Ramur chipwood. There's a nice alternative that you can use, whether it's, say, all of your soft fruit prunings or all of the prunings that you've made from your apple trees this year, or perhaps you have a load of wild brambles that are just taking over. If you cut those back and you chop them up roughly with some shears, and then you can actually spread that over the surface, that is going to work just as well. In terms of the bacterial side of things, just making sure that there's plenty of organic matter in the soil is just the easiest way of going about it. I think it's a good time to note that nothing about growing food needs to be complicated. It's just putting together and cherry picking a load of different ideas that kind of make sense to your context and applying it. But usually it kind of comes down to adding some more organic matter into the soil. With your composting methods, you can kind of get a little bit creative. You could create maybe more of a tomato blend compost, where over time you're both breaking down wood chip, but then you're adding other kind of nutritious materials, you're adding grass clippings, and you're just creating a slightly more carbon-based compost. And that is going to, of course, benefit the fungi, but carbon in the soil is so important for all of the bacteria as well. If you've never grown tomato plants before, here are 3 really useful tips that you can use on top of everything that I've mentioned in this video. The first thing is, don't feel tempted to grow tomato plants really close together. You think, oh, I might get more tomatoes, but what's going to happen is that you're going to have a lot of foliage and it's going to cast shade on all the tomato plants around it. And that's going to drastically reduce the photosynthesis rates of your plants, and so you're going to get less growth and less yields. Tomato plants want as much daylight as possible, so don't be afraid to space them out a little bit more than recommended. The next tip is to plant the tomato plants pretty deep. What that is going to mean is that they have just more access to the nutrients, but also more access to water that is further down in the ground. And the third tip for indeterminate tomato plants is just to keep on top of pruning those suckers. It just allows the tomato plant to refocus its energy on growing and producing fruit, and what suckers create is extra shade, reduces the airflow, and can increase risk of disease. Earlier in the video I mentioned 2 fantastic amendments, liquid amendments that boost soil health: LAB and JMS. And the easiest one to get started with is JMS, and you want to make JMS where you're going to use it. So you want to make the JMS in the polytunnel if that's where you're going to be growing tomatoes. And I've got this video here, which is a short, that shows you the process, a simple process of making your own Jardam microbial solution to help boost your soil health.